Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here to present the differences and the nuances between corporate and education instructional design. This is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about. As you know, if you follow me on LinkedIn, I talk a lot about job transitioning and into instructional design, but I think it's really important that we highlight these two different sectors that are the largest in the instructional design field. And it really takes a lot to understand what the different nuances are if you're thinking about transitioning into a role. So this is going to help you understand better what the attributes of each of these different sectors are. And maybe I'll give a little bit of advice and share a couple things about how to properly transition if you're looking for a role in one of these two sectors. So, just a quick background about myself. For those who haven't met me before, I started my career out as a high school educator, and then I transitioned into higher education, instructional design, instructional technology, a variety of different roles that are on the peripheral of learning and development. And I did that for about a decade. And most recently, I'm coming up on my 2 year, we call it an anniversary with Amazon. So I've been in the corporate space for about 2 years now, and I've done some freelance work as well in the corporate space. So I'm really excited to share with you some of the differences between these two sectors as you continue to navigate in whatever part of the journey that you're in when it comes to job transitioning or your career, and thinking about, do I want to go into corporate? Do I want to go into education? And really thinking about the pros and the cons of both. So if I think they shared a link to this infographic, so keep that in your bookmarks bar so you can refer back to it later. But one of the things definitely want to talk about, go through the different audiences, like salary ranges, stuff like that, the important stuff, and really give you a top level and maybe a little bit more specific overview of each. So one of the things I noticed when I transitioned from education to corporate instructional design is corporate is really focused on the skills of the job, time to proficiency, things that like return on investment, like what is happening is very transactional. What's happening with people onboarding? How quickly can we get them to do their jobs? They're tied to learning objectives, they're tied to business goals in the corporate space. Whereas education in that environment, it's more academic. So it's like you're in an academic setting, you may or may not be in a classroom, whether that's a virtual, hybrid, or in person. And really it's about knowledge acquisition, and there is some skill development in the academic space, but really it's something that you want to do. Sometimes in corporate, those skills and things are things we have to do or we're required to do. But in education, people usually go get certificates or other degrees if they want to have that credential and have say, like, I know instructional design and education, and I got this certificate, so now I can become an instructional designer, or go into a role and then upskill as you go into that role. So those are the two differences, two very different feels of the environments as well. Like education, and I've said this before in other presentations, is notoriously slower to come into the modern age with certain things like AI, certain technologies that come onto the market. It takes a little bit. There's some hoops to jump through, whereas corporate is more innovative. So just giving you an idea in your head of thinking about, like, education, very much think about the classroom. Corporate, people everywhere across the world, they're, people are remote, they're hybrid, and thinking about, gaining those skills in the space. Now, I intentionally put salary ranges as the second one because I know that's something that everybody is interested in when it comes to if you're shifting roles into a role in instructional design or anything learning and development peripheral, education or corporate. So one of the things, let's say, for example, the average teacher salary in the United States is about $68,000, which isn't terrible, but it depends upon where you live, where the cost of living situation is, and those types of things. But education and instructional designers in education make around the 70 the 75 range if you're first starting out, and that has gone up. But it varies based on institution, where you're at in the particular sector. So if you're in K through 12 or higher education, what state you're in, what district you're in, because we know there's a lot of different districts across the United States. There's struggling districts and there's districts that are very affluent. But definitely, if you go into the higher ed or education instructional design space, you're going to make more than you would, say, as an educator, but they are a lower paying scale when it comes to compared with corporate. I will say at a certain point in my career, when I became an instructional designer in higher education in New York, I was making upwards of a six figure and just being an instructional designer, an individual contributor. But if you go into corporate, it's more lucrative in that space. Definitely have, it's more competitive. You have higher salaries. Corporate instructional designers typically make around 85,000 and upwards, and you can grow in a lot of the roles in the corporate space. So you have that growth readiness. Like a lot of companies, for example, Amazon, always want you to grow. You can grow and develop and level up, get promoted. Whereas in education, it's kind of like hit or miss with those growth opportunities. So you really have to think about, like, what are the pros and the cons of these different things. And I know salary is important to people. And I tell people that when you're going into interviews and such, you should definitely, if there's not a salary range listed, you should definitely ask that in the initial phone screen or one of the initial interviews. It's okay to ask that. I know that's very taboo in some cultures, but definitely need to get clarity around that, because that's your livelihood. So now, taking a look at the different types of audiences that these two entities serve. So for education, it's students, it's learners, a variety of ages. I think non-traditional learner is not even a thing anymore. Like, everybody is coming into these education spaces now, especially with the availability of online asynchronous courses. And they're designed around different standards, different accrediting bodies that have certain academic expectations for the institution. Are you fulfilling these learning objectives? Just like with corporate, with business goals, accrediting bodies want higher education institutions to meet certain expectations. So it's typically, these are students, these are learners, participants, whatever you want to call them. And you have the opportunity to be with these people throughout the whole semester, or if you're in K through 12, it's throughout the whole year. So we're really catering to that pedagogy piece of this. And there is some andragogy in this, adult learning theory. But when you jump into the corporate space, it's a hodgepodge of people coming from all different backgrounds, all different skill levels. So you're really trying to, when you're designing the learning experience, you have to hit all the different things when it comes to, from beginner to intermediate to advanced, and really help them upskill themselves. So it's a variety of different people. Like millennials are dominating the workforce at this point. The Gen Zs are coming in. If we're talking about generational stuff, so thinking about the different experiences those types of people have, and growing up with technology, and having access to things like AI now. So how do we accommodate those things? So definitely different environments. And corporate, like I said before, is focused on meeting those organizational or business goals. When you're thinking about the alignment piece of whatever e-learnings or trainings that you're offering, and this piece is really about andragogy. So you're dealing with all adult learners here. So you have to consider that into the equation as well. It's not pedagogy. It's not the younger learners. You're not like going through a lesson, and then there's some sort of like assessment at the end. But there is an assessment at the end. It's just different. What do adult learners need to be motivated, and how do you get them engaged in certain activities? It's a lot more difficult to consider that than it is, say, for the younger pedagogical situations. And again, I've already mentioned this. And when we're talking about instructional design, we have the standards that everybody has to follow, and understanding what the theories are behind instructional design is important Educational institutions often have a process that they follow when it comes to reviewing courses, making sure that they align with their standards, and understanding, like, things like accessibility are important. They may be using a rubric such as quality matters for quality assurance to make sure that the courses are fulfilling the expectations, and that, again, that connection there aligns with this at the course level, then at the broader university level, and then ultimately at the accrediting body level, that everything is connected and aligned, and you can dive back down deep and find out where these connections started and how everything just is meshed together. So in the corporate space, like, you're really tying it to your role, like what you're doing and your skills. For example, as an instructional designer in the corporate environment, I have to know things like iSpring. I have to understand learning management systems. I have to, be able to project manage. And that's not necessarily something that is occurring in the academic space. So I have to be able to perform in my role. And the company that I work for was to really get that in return on investment. If they're investing training in their workers, they want to make sure that, again, that time to proficiency, the cost of things, emphasizing that real world practical job skills, things that are applicable right away. Whereas education, it's more, a lot of the times it starts out with very theoretical knowledge. This is something in the training space, in the corporate space, where it's got to be applicable right away. You got to be able to use it. And that's, again, that ties back to andragogy with the adult learners and how they want things to be applicable right away. We want it to be relevant to what we do on a daily basis. So just thinking about your own situations, and whether you're in education or corporate or another sector, think about the different things that you've had to do recently when it comes to training. And, think about, like, what it's transactional, what is the company getting, what am I getting, in terms of, when you're taking the training, what happens afterwards? Is it something you have to do yearly, biannually? Do you have to do it monthly? Do you have to upskill at a certain level? Is there a 30, 60, 90-day plan? And those specific types of situations. So we've come to the assessment portion. So again, pedagogy and andragogy are a big part of this. If you think about the academic space, everybody probably had, the anxiety about final exams, final projects, things that have to be done, presentations, those capstone things when you're getting into the graduate level courses. So educational really focuses on some of the more formative, summative type situations that are more formal, where students at the end of a semester or at the end of a term, they're taking some sort of larger assessment or developing something to say that they have learned or understand what the expectation was, and they're bringing some kind of deliverable to the situation. And it's, again, it's tied to everything. It's tied to the standards, it's tied to the learning objectives, that's tied to the accreditation, and hopefully in that situation too, it's tied to what's happening out in the market as well, so that you get the whole connection there of the full experience of what's happening. Now, assessments in the corporate environment, metrics, data, practical skills, like, one of the things that I absolutely love designing with Amazon, and I know other people do this at other corporations as well, is simulations of our system. So really putting people in that real world experience so that they can, click through whatever click path they have to use in order to understand a system, in order to perform their job well. For example, we have customer care agents, and they have to internally use certain systems, and they have to make sure that they're doing things correctly to prevent things like MRE or sharing, PHI. Like, we can't, HIPAA violations, things like that. We don't want any of that. So some of these things very much based off of the performance and what you're doing, like, right now in your job, and it's completely applicable. So the assessments are more focused on that, whereas, in education, it's like a culmination of everything you've done throughout a certain amount of time. So I would say that from working in education for about, let's see, I did 4 years at K through 12 and then 10 years in higher education. It's more, education is very traditional. You know, when higher education institutions started, it was very much the sage on the stage, the instructor at the center of the room, and then the audience and the instructor is lecturing. Nowadays, we've become more student centered, where students are doing things like group projects. We have Zoom breakout rooms where they can work together if we're in a virtual setting. And we do try to make things more interactive, but still there's more of that traditional sense of the instructor, you know, kind of being the facilitator of things, and also making sure that they're offering feedback and there's grading and things like that in the more traditional approach. And then the corporate environment is really about it, it can be very self-paced. You may be responsible for your own learning, you know, and how scalable it is, in the sense that if you are trying to do something, where you're trying to maybe get a promotion and you want to be more advanced in certain systems, you have the beginning, intermediate, advanced opportunities. So really it's the e-learning situations that I talked about, the virtual trainings. There may be in-person or hybrid stuff depending upon the organization that you work for, but for the most part it's a digital, very digital space. And education still very much has that brick and mortar feel. There's, you know, tons of higher education institutions that still exist. In corporate, you can do it mostly anywhere, anytime, from your you know, your computer, as we're sitting here right now in this virtual session. So again, corporate is very much like self-paced, and having some flexibility, whereas education, just think of that as more traditional. And one of the questions that I get asked most of the time is that, what technologies do I need to know? The first thing I want to say about this is, if you're thinking about transitioning to a role in instructional design, knowing the technology comes secondary to understanding the theories and the knowledge behind what instructional design is. So simply knowing and being an expert in iSpring, while it's fantastic to know that, and great to know the learning management system things, you have to understand why these things exist. What do they do for the learners? So when we're talking about the education space, it's a lot of those instructional technologies that I think about, like things like Edpuzzle, Nearpod, Cahoots. Those types of things are what's happening in the education space. These ed tech tools that are very much gamified, I see them, they bleed over into each other, honestly, with the different types of technologies you need to know. But education, again, those techs are more pedagogical based, like I said, gamified. You know, we have in education, the learning management systems are different than they are in the corporate space. So they operate a little bit differently. There's SCORM stuff in corporate, and then LMS in education. You can get pull data and different things in the background, but it's mostly you're designing it within the LMS and you can update it instantly. So think about some of the tools that you've used throughout, whether you've been in the classroom or if you've been on the learner side of it, what types of tools that your instructors have used. Think about those, like, to get you engaged in the conversation. That's very education. In the corporate space, we have a lot of the e-learning authoring tools like iSpring. So don't overwhelm yourself with having to know everything. I tell people, when you're trying to upskill, just know enough to be dangerous, when it comes to understanding these technologies. And again, the technologies come secondary. They do differ quite a bit, in terms of what you have to know. And I feel like, from being in education versus corporate's a little bit more advanced when it comes to the technologies that you have to be able to understand, versus education, where you know, there's certain types of trainers or instructional coaches that will help you. In corporate, you kind of upskill yourself, or you work with your co-workers, to do that. I think I went through it all. So one of the things I definitely want to offer some advice on is, if you are thinking of, as we wrap up the session here, if you are thinking about transitioning into the role, one of the things these are the two biggest sectors, there are others, is really think about, and I tell people when I work with them, to write down, where do you want to be? Where do you want to be? So thinking about in your career, and knowing all these different nuances now and these different differences between the two, where do you want to be, and write that down, and then align that with your passions, whether that's personal or professional, and figure out what company you want to work for, read some job descriptions, do the research, and notice that I'm saying do all this before you even start applying to roles. So use this resource as like a jumping off point for you if you're thinking about transitioning to a role into instructional design, especially you educators, and think about really where you want to be and what you want to do. Obviously, education is going to be a great transition for you because you understand that space more, and corporate might be more of like a culture shock leap, but definitely, figure out where you want to be and then go from there and start doing the research.
Right. That's it, Holly.
Yeah. Right on time.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We are so
Thank you.
grateful for your amazing presentation and infographics that is going to be very handy for, I'm sure, so many of our viewers. We have more than 530 watching at the moment,
Oh
which is
my goodness.
fantastic. Yeah, right?
That's
Holly, we
awesome.
do. Yeah, exactly. We do have some time though, which is amazing. So I would love to use this time to ask a couple of questions. We do have them in the chat. I also have a couple of questions on my own because I was listening to the presentation and even making notes. And I was also going to inspire everybody in the chat to write their questions right now because we still have a chance to ask Holly live when she's with us online. Alternatively, you might want to reach out to her on LinkedIn and follow up on the speech, of course. So
Absolutely.
Holly, just to consider that there are a lot of audience members who come out of the US who are not very familiar with the local microclimate and local corporate culture. I'd like to ask you to summarize one thing for me. When you are comparing the two options, effectively, they're not the only ones, of course, but two important ones and major ones. It seems for many, at least from what I see in the chat and what I hear in the private conversations, that corporate seems very lucrative for many. Higher salary range, a lot of high-paced development, interactivity, etc., etc. How would you summarize the top 2 or 3 really nice, amazing things that you believe are very specific only for educational areas?
Education, I feel like in education you're truly changing the lives of people because they're still growing and learning.
Yeah.
So I love that aspect about being in the K through 12 classroom or the higher education classroom. I still teach graduate students, so at all levels I feel like you're at this point in my career, and I know a lot of people are at this point, you are giving back in education, whereas corporate is very focused on the right now, like getting you to proficiency. But education, it feels more like a community service experience, or like you're developing that sense of community. And I love that aspect. I've been a mentor, I've been a mentee, and just made so many fabulous connections in the education space. That's one thing I love about it. And also too, I feel like in education, the longevity that somebody stays in a position is much higher than, say, in the corporate space. There's lots of turnover in the corporate space. So in education, you really develop this sense of like you have lots of teams, people, different departments that you work with, and they stay in there for a long time. So I'm gonna relate this to a sports analogy. So when a coach constantly is turned over, say for like a baseball team or something like that, that really creates some friction within the team, or within, and thinking about it from a higher ed perspective within the institution, like if there's a constant turnover. But normally people stay there for longer, and that creates this opportunity to have routine and to develop processes that work for everybody, and you just have more of like this camaraderie, I guess you could say. So I really like the education space for that, and that's one of the things I miss about education, even though I'm still in it, that sense of like the community and stuff. Yeah, those are really great things that higher ed and K through 12 do. You like feel really, I don't want to say family, you really feel this sense of like everybody supporting each other.
Thank you so much, Holly. And I see that there are other commenters joining in the chat with their visions how to answer this question. So I appreciate
Yeah.
community support. Thank you so much. We have collected a good number of questions, and I'd like to ask you if maybe we can go through some of them. A user under nickname MD Alessandri was sharing that there is a difference between content curriculum design versus how the content is delivered, instructional design. And there was this huge discussion about that in the chat about these things being used interchangeably, which shouldn't be the case. Could you just make a quick comment
No.
on that if you don't mind?
Yeah. So when I think about curriculum design, my head automatically goes to subject matter expert. When you're designing curriculum, you have to understand what you're designing. So you're an expert in X, you're an expert in pharmacy, you're an expert in healthcare, you're an expert in biology. Curriculum design, you become the person that knows the content very, very well. When you're thinking about instructional design, you're designing the overall experience. They are absolutely correct, and I 100% agree with that. You're thinking about the different ways to engage people, how the mind works. There's a lot of psychology behind the situation, whereas the subject matter expert and maybe the curriculum or content designer is just focused on that, the content. They may have some knowledge of these different instructional design things. They may bleed into each other, but I think like subject matter expert as opposed to the person designing the whole experience from the content.
Right, experience designer basically. UX
Yes.
for UX for education. All right.
Yep.
Another question that I have here is from Brenda asking what technologies are helpful for simulations in the workplace?
I would definitely say that you want to use iSpring to get some of those simulation based things in. And a lot of the time, what we use is, different videos with click paths and utilizing the technology to just call out different areas and have them go through. So you really have to take a complicated process and simplify it down. So you're going to have to go step by step and thinking about that, and what technologies can do that. There's a variety on the market. There's a different ones uh, to mention, but it depends on how you want to. I would need to like get an idea of what the situation is. It's case by case scenario, how that's going to work out for you. Is it going to be a video? Is it going to be a click path? When I say click path, they're clicking through. Or is it going to be something like more top level, like a job aid, where they just need to see like a flow chart or something like that? So it really depends. It's situational. And you can do all those things with iSpring.
Right. Thank you, Holly.
You're welcome.
Another quick question from Pravin. Do you feel like scenario-based learning will be equally used in both places, educational and corporate?
I do. I feel like that has definitely become a thing, especially for the older students when they're matriculating through primary, middle, high school, and going off to college. Like scenario based can be used with the younger generations as well. Like think about word problems. I used to hate those when I was younger. Like those are scenario based situations. Like this happens and this happens. So what does this equal, or what is this? I do see it used more in the corporate space and some of the branching scenarios, but I definitely think that you can use scenario based branching in both environments.
Right. And I would probably just try to shoot the very last question, which might take a long time, but I would kindly ask you to please summarize it in a very quick list of maybe bullet points. The
Okay.
question is from Liane. I hope I read the name correctly. What are your top 3 tips for transitioning from an educational ID job to a corporate ID job?
Um, the top 3 things that I would do when transitioning from an education to a corporate ID job is number one, I would make sure that you understand the technologies that are used. I know I said that wasn't number one, but you need to understand the differences between what technologies are used. Number two, you need to be ready for fast-paced environments in corporate. Education, like I said, is notoriously slower. So you need to be prepared to be innovative and go outside of your comfort zone. When it comes to corporate, it goes really fast and it's okay to fail. So be comfortable with failing because it's going to happen all the time. And then the third thing I would say is that you need to develop some very deep connections with people out on LinkedIn world in the community, who are already in these roles, and get advice from them. And don't make these relationships transactional. These need to be good connections, because I get a lot of messages in my inbox with people say, review my resume, tell me the best advice. And I just share my link to my curated resources or something like that. Look at the person's profile, get to know them, know about their experience, honor their experience, and then start talking to them about what you want to do.